Hey, hello. Good morning. It's early morning, and I'm in my camper, which is parked at a Home Two Suites in Buckeye, Arizona. We are traveling at the end of spring break with our friends, um, Samuel and his two best friends, and one of my best friends, and they're still sleeping. So I decided to come out to the camper and record this week's chapter reading. If you're new here, let me introduce myself. I'm Rosa Linda Román. I go by Rosa Linda, and each week I read a chapter of my book, Losing Sight of the Shore: How to Live on a Boat Without Killing Your Family. Um, and it's been a lot of fun. I'm enjoying it, but I've realized I needed to plan a little bit more ahead because there's no way on spring break. We're actually driving from San Diego to Albuquerque, and I'm not going to be able to do it live as I normally do. So I'm recording this the morning of instead. So this is a long chapter. Prepare yourselves. Hopefully you enjoy this. And we'll just get right to it. And also, by the way, thank you for all of you who have posted comments and support in these recordings. I'm really enjoying it. And if you want to either get a copy of the book, or I'm posting the chapters one at a time each week on my Substack. All of that is in the show notes, so you can find that there. But without further ado, this is Losing Sight of the Shore: How to Live on a Boat Without Killing Your Family, Chapter 10, Crystal Kayak. When you move onto a boat, the first thing you think about is how you will sail to distant shores. When we moved onto the Dawn Treader, we poured a lot of money and time into making sure we had everything we needed to get from Florida to the Bahamas and perhaps beyond as safely and as comfortably as possible. The rigging was checked, the sails were tested, the radar, water maker, and AIS systems were upgraded. We did all this to make sure we could get from here to there. But we learned the hard way that the big boat was not the only boat a live aboard family should upgrade. In fact, every form of transportation matters when you live on a boat. If the catamaran or monohull is your house, then the dinghy or tender is your car or SUV. You may get to the most magnificent tropical islands, but without a properly functioning dinghy or an affinity for swimming to the grocery store or laundromat, you will not be able to get to that amazing island to actually enjoy it. The problem is we didn't fully appreciate the importance of a good dinghy until we were already in a position to need one. Like the big boat, a dinghy needs a proper name, and we felt we chose one suitable for a vessel our family would rely on: Reepicheep. In case you haven't read The Chronicles of Narnia by C.S. Lewis, which is where both our boat and dinghy names came from, and which I believe you should read at some point in this lifetime, let me tell you what that means. In the book, The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, there's a character who is small in stature but large in valor, a mouse named Reepicheep. This little mouse was feisty and valiant and would protect her crew at all costs. We thought that would be the perfect name for our little boat. She certainly proved to be feisty, but not quite as valiant as we had hoped, as we spent an obscene amount of time trying to get her going throughout our adventures aboard the Dawn Treader. On more than one occasion, we found ourselves stranded on shore or on our boat and had to either row or get another cruiser to tow us back to our destination. The culprit was a 9.9 horsepower four-stroke motor. Like marine toilets, these motors were notorious for breaking down, but also like marine toilets, these motors were better than a lot of the other options out there. After seeing other families with motorless, deflating, or constantly flooding dinghies, we counted ourselves lucky to have Reepicheep, regardless of her moods, and she did play a vital role in our enjoyment of the many wonderful islands along the way. When they are behaving, dinghies may be the most efficient option, but they certainly aren't the only way to get from shore to your anchorage. In the more popular cruising areas, you can often hail a water taxi on the VHF radio to pick you up at your boat. But this isn't cheap and falls in the dinghy category of functional ways to get to shore. In the fun transportation category, there are kayaks and paddleboards, which are slower, use muscle power to get there, and can be challenging or even dangerous in the wrong conditions. Finally, there's the super fun transportation category, which is where my favorite boat to shore vessel would be the fun, fabulous Crystal Kayak. I discovered this when my husband bought one for me as a Hanukkah gift right before we sailed to the Bahamas in December of 2016. A Crystal Kayak is completely see-through. When Nathan gave it to me, Nala and I were very excited to be paddling around Peanut Island in West Palm Beach. But that water is dark and murky with very limited visibility. It wasn't until we got to the blue and crystal clear Bahamian waters that I fell in love with the thing. The downside of the Crystal Kayak is that it is large, more like a two-seater canoe than an individual kayak, and hard to store on deck. But that is also part of the upside. With the Crystal Kayak, I was able to transport 2 kids and a German Shepherd from our boat to the shore, a fact that came in handy on more than one occasion when Reepicheep was being especially difficult. 2 of my most vivid memories in the Crystal Kayak both happened at Highbourne Key in the Exumas. The first was when we had just arrived after a long, uncomfortable crossing from Eleuthera to the Exumas, and everyone was eager to get off the boat. We were still pretty new to the kayak, mostly because it took 2 people to carry it to the back of the boat and put it in the water without sinking it. Plus, we were always on the go and rarely stayed anywhere long enough to justify the effort. But on this day, we put her in the water and tied her to the dinghy as we made our first trip to shore. This allowed us to get to shore more quickly without wearing ourselves out completely, because getting anywhere in the Crystal Kayak was quite the workout, and we were working against the current. It was great to step on those white sand beaches and stretch our legs a bit. Nala acted like she had died and gone to heaven, running around the beach and swimming in the shallow water. While Nathan, Ahava, and Ziva stayed on shore with Nala, Ziva and I paddled out over the shallows in the Crystal Kayak. Suddenly, Ziva yelled, "Stop here!" grabbed her snorkel, and jumped out of the kayak. A few minutes later, she came up, smiling from ear to ear. Not easy to do with a snorkel in your mouth, holding a perfect sand dollar in her hand. It would be the first of many that she and the other kids would collect from the Crystal Kayak over the next few days. Ziva stayed in the water as I paddled around, stopping every few minutes as she dove down to collect more of the white, circular treasures. Eventually, the other kids joined her and collected several of their own. The plexiglass cases where we display those sand dollars and some of our most treasured shells from our liveaboard life sit in our living room to this day. It's rare to find sand dollars intact unless they are alive. Alive, they are brown with a mossy surface. Dead, they are bleach white. We don't collect live sea creatures, so these beautiful white sand dollars, completely intact, were a treasure. They are very fragile and break at the slightest wave or a child's overeager handling. Plus, they are generally buried in the sand with just a tiny edge showing, so Ziva's finding them was a real accomplishment. This is why it was such a perfect day on the Dawn Treader. The kids had been looking for sand dollars for months since we had moved onto the boat, but had never discovered any until they got to the treasure trove at Highbourne Key. The water was so clear, and thanks to the Crystal Kayak, we could see sand dollars and sea stars as we paddled 10 feet or more above them. Unlike every other place we had been, the sea life was abundant there, and there is a good reason for this. Highbourne Key sits just north of a pretty spectacular place called the Exuma Land and Sea Park. It is a nature preserve where you are forbidden to take anything. They are quite serious about this. In the Waterway Guide to the Bahamas, they warn cruisers that taking the smallest shell or piece of driftwood can yield hefty fines or get you kicked out of the country. We completely avoided the Land and Sea Park our first time in the Exumas because I worried that Samuel or Nala might accidentally, on purpose, carry off some treasure and we would find ourselves in deep water. Instead, we explored the beach and the reef at the safer island just north of the park and were richly rewarded with some of our favorite finds. With sand dollars and shells littering its bottom, we headed back to the Dawn Treader, where the second most vivid crystal kayak memory happened. Late that afternoon, we were in the cabin after getting cleaned up from our shore adventures when Nala started barking like crazy. This was pretty unusual for her when we were away from a marina's foot traffic, so we went on deck to investigate. Generally, Nala's aggressive barking like this meant that someone was approaching our boat, so we scanned the area and the more distant horizon. There were no boats coming anywhere near us, but Nala kept barking. It wasn't until we looked down into the water that we discovered what she was so upset about. Here, right below our boat, were two very large sharks. I am horribly afraid of sharks. I literally have nightmares about sharks all the time, and avoiding sharks is high on my list of priorities whenever I am anywhere near the water. In fact, there's a funny story from when Nathan and I first started dating that can offer a little insight into how sharkophobic I am. At the time, back in 1997, he owned a 26-foot Boston Whaler powerboat, and he liked to take her out on the water in the Florida Keys on weekends. The first time we did this, we motored out for about an hour, and we were having a great time when I suddenly announced, "Okay, we should head back now." "Why, aren't you having a good time?" he asked, surprised. "Yes, a great time, but I have to pee," I replied. "So just pee in the water," he said. "Are you kidding me?" I said. "I pee in the water all the time." I could tell he thought I was hilarious, but I had to pee, and this was definitely not funny. "Yes, but you can do that while standing on deck." "True, but if I'm swimming, I pee in the water. No big deal." "Well, I can't do that because I'm not going in the water." "Why not?" "Because of the sharks." "What sharks?" he asked. "The sharks that are everywhere just below the surface of the water." He laughed at me. I got mad. Here I was sharing one of my greatest fears, and he was laughing. "I'm sorry for laughing," he said, "but it's just that there aren't sharks everywhere under the water." "I've seen Jaws," I said, "and I'm not getting in that water." In the end, I did get in the water to pee, but rushed back into the boat in a panic as quickly as possible. That was the trip that led me to something that would change my perception of the ocean and of myself. That fear of sharks is the reason I learned to scuba dive. This might sound crazy, given my paralyzing fear, but I did love the ocean and knew it would be good for me. Plus, Nathan is a very persuasive guy. So persuasive that he not only convinced me, but also his coworker, Gary Barker, who happened to be paraplegic. Gary and I spent several weeks as dive buddies in a pool in Winter Haven, Florida, and both got our scuba certification at the end of that course. It's a skill set that I'm grateful for and which I have used many, many times since. But on this particular day in Highborn Key, Exumas, I was grateful that I didn't get into the water. Seeing those two huge sharks hanging out below our boat, my heart stopped for a second or two. Nathan promptly pointed out that they were nurse sharks, which he claims are like big catfish and completely harmless. But I've always suspected they wanted this reputation just so they could lure you into the water and eat you. Normally, when you have a large predator within 10 feet of your family, you have this amazing natural tendency to want to get as far away from them as possible. I learned this a few years earlier when we were living in our mountain home in New Mexico. The home sits on 75 acres in the forested mountains outside of Albuquerque, and there are lots of critters there. On this particular day, I was home alone with the kids when our then German Shepherd Tova started barking like crazy. There, not 10 feet from the sliding glass doors, was a massive brown bear playing in the man-made waterfalls pond in our backyard. In hindsight, I realize I probably didn't handle it in the best way for our kids' development, but I panicked and screamed and corralled everyone upstairs. This terrified the kids probably more than the sight of the bear. Later, Nathan lovingly pointed out that I should have stayed calm for the sake of the kids, and logically, I know this is true. Eventually, the bear got annoyed with all the noise from the dog and the mama and sauntered away. I think she may have flipped me the bird on the way back up the hill. So, on that shark day at Highborn Key, I knew I needed to stay calm. But there was my worst fear right in the water below our boat. I felt safe up there on deck, knowing those sea creatures couldn't get us as long as we stayed on the boat. But suddenly, Ziva destroyed my feelings of security by coming out with her bathing suit on. "What are you doing?" I cried. "Going to swim with the sharks," she replied. "I know you are not supposed to curse in front of children, but there may have been an expletive or two that slipped from my horrified mouth at that point. Are you insane? Why would you think would be okay to jump in with two sharks below our boat? Daddy always says nurse sharks are harmless." Oi. All of this happened in the blink of an eye. With some backing by Nathan, I managed to convince Ziva that this was not a good time for a swim. But she really wanted to see them better, and so I did something that I never in a million years thought I would do when seeing two sharks below my boat. I hopped in the crystal kayak to get a better look. Now, those of you on land, especially those who happen to be the more sensible anti-shark types, will be shaking your heads right about now, wondering why I would have done such a thing. And to be honest, as I write this from the comfort of a shark-free room on land, I see that it does sound pretty stupid. But at the time, it seemed like a good idea. As I jumped in the crystal kayak, Ahava jumped in too. We paddled directly over the sharks and got a view of them that was better than any aquarium I've ever seen. Watching the video I recorded that day is pretty funny because I was shocked at myself and still quite scared. It was an experience I will not soon forget. They were completely disinterested in us and eventually swam away. Once again, the crystal kayak was the perfect way to connect with the wild, wonderful world we were living in. Over the year or so we sailed with the crystal kayak on board, it was a catalyst for many magnificent stories. Among my favorite were the daily paddles to Peanut Island with Nala, and the time we paddled beside a dolphin mama and her baby in the Bahamas. I could go on and on about the good moments with that wonderful kayak. But I should also say that there were some moments when the crystal kayak caused some real challenges by having her on board. As I mentioned, she was much larger than a normal kayak, more like a canoe at 11 feet long, and weighed 48 pounds, not 400. Unlike a regular kayak that could sit on the rear davit holding up the dinghy, the crystal kayak needed to be stored on the forward deck, upside down, and secured with straps to keep her from catching wind and doing some serious damage to the boat or her crew. This made it harder for me to use the kayak because I couldn't just lift her over a railing or down the aft steps and toss her in the water. Carrying her was definitely a two-person job, and putting her in the water had to be done just right or risk having one end underwater before you got the other end in. For a successful launch, you and the other person carrying her had to perch themselves precariously on the sugar scoop, the strange name assigned to the rear steps on a catamaran, count 1, 2, 3, and throw her onto the surface of the water at the same time, all while hoping one of you has a strong enough grasp on the rope to prevent the kayak from quickly drifting away in the current behind the boat. Then, once you were done exploring the anchorage, it took two people to get her out of the water, doing all those steps in reverse in order to secure her, which was always a challenge when you were already tired from kayaking. Still, I was super grateful to have her on board, perhaps never more so than during our final days of living aboard the Dawn Treader. We were on a mooring ball in a place called Hole 3 off Stocking Island in Exuma, Bahamas, and it was a very stressful time for our family. This was right after New Year's 2018 and a fantastic holiday with friends. We found ourselves in a race against time to get to Puerto Rico, where we would be hosting our family's first bat mitzvah, a religious celebration where a teenage girl becomes fully responsible for her actions, which is celebrated at a big party with family and friends. And our plans to sail there fell through. Since we originally intended to sail to Puerto Rico, we had not planned to pack up our belongings and leave our boat and dog behind, so we were scrambling to get everything done in about a week. This at the same time that the kids and I had made some amazing new friends and wanted to maximize our time with them. Adding to the chaos, Nathan left on a work trip, and our nanny, the amazing Lauren Miller, was spending more time away from the boat as she wrestled with what our change of plans, i.e., not sailing to Puerto Rico, would mean for her. This, of course, is when our dinghy died. The dinghy died, and it never stopped raining, like deluge raining. Rain that would have looked awfully familiar to Noah as he drifted away in the ark. There we were, trying to pack up the boat to be gone for who knew how long, maybe forever, while trying to enjoy the little bit of time we had left with friends, and we couldn't get anywhere. Because the Dawn Treader had been moved to the no live aboard mooring field where she would be stored in our absence, we were not anywhere near other cruisers who we could have easily hitched a ride with. Gratefully, the reason we were at that particular mooring area was because it was owned by the family who would be watching our dog and who were incredibly generous to us. Not only did they allow us to live aboard for the week we were prepping to leave, but they also gave us access to a cottage on shore where we could stay while we tried to get things ready. With a broken dinghy, our only other boat to shore options were either a paddleboard or the Crystal Kayak. Neither option was ideal with 3 kids, 1 nanny, a dog, and an unrelenting deluge. Still, we managed with a combination of the kayak and hitching rides with the property's caretaker and our amazing friends who were willing to get soaked both ways in order to lend a hand. At first, we did a lot of back and forth between the Dawn Treader and the shore. The kids wanted nothing more than to be on land with other boat kids, exploring Cavalli House's amazing, well-groomed trails and endless white sand beaches. I pretty much wanted that too, but I knew we would be catching a flight in a few days, and the boat was a hot mess. Nathan had wanted me to leave it show ready because in his mind we were all ready to sell her the minute we stepped foot off of her and headed to Puerto Rico. I subconsciously wanted to trash the boat so no one else would want her. The reality fell somewhere in the middle. Mostly I would take 2 or 3 trips to shore in the Crystal Kayak, leave the kids and Nala there with Miss Lauren, thank God for her, and row back to the Dawn Treader to sort through belongings and pack what I thought we might need. I was continuously soaked to the bone. Everyone was. But that is a lot more fun when you are running on a beach with a pack of wild island kids than it is when you are trying to play responsible grown-up, preparing your family for a major life change. If you detect a hint of bitterness in my tone here, I suppose I must admit that I sometimes still remember this time with strong emotions. Hindsight being what it is, I can honestly say it was the right decision for our family at the time. I wouldn't be writing this memoir or launching my podcast if we hadn't left the Dawn Treader when we did. I am actually writing this chapter from the 32nd floor of the Wynn Hotel in Las Vegas, Nevada, overlooking Trump's mega casino, along with the Mirage, the Palazzo, the Venetian, and Treasure Island. Yesterday, we flew here from Seattle, Washington, where I took Nathan to a Green Bay Packers Seattle Seahawks game for our 20th anniversary. Sadly, the Packers lost. 2 weeks ago, we spent 5 days in Kona, Hawaii, also for our anniversary. In other words, I am not suffering. And when I'm honest, I know that the boat was taking its toll on my husband. We are here for a work conference, and he is happy to be back in a position where he can do his job without needing to take an unreliable dinghy, a water taxi, a prop plane, and 2 additional flights just to get to a meeting. Not to mention that the kids are all thriving on land. Ahava in her gymnastics, Samuel in his school and sports, and Ziva in volleyball and flag football. We are definitely more productive based on traditional measures than we were while living aboard. So, despite the twinge of resentment in the lines between my words, I am exactly where I need to be right now, and I am perfectly fine. But 11 months ago, I was not perfectly fine. I was pretty miserable, actually. The time had gotten away from me, mostly because I chose to host get-togethers in the cabin with all of our favorite kid boat families instead of packing and prepping, and we were down to the last 24 hours before our flight. In the only way that this salty tale could go, that night was the worst storm of the season. There was crazy lightning and thunder to go with the rain, and all of our friends had gone back to their boats for the night. Lauren and I decided it would be best for her to stay in the cabin with the kids and Nala so that I could be alone on the boat to pack. We had walkie-talkies to communicate from land to boat if needed, but I was worried since I didn't have any way to get to them quickly in an emergency. That night began well, with me getting a lot done around the boat and even getting the chance to record a podcast episode while I worked. Lauren and I checked in a couple times, and it seemed like they were all fine despite the storm. She said they were going to bed and not to worry about them. Then the skies opened up even more than before. One massive lightning strike, quite close, knocked out all the power on shore, making the already black night dark as pitch. I confirmed that they were okay just before I heard a wrenching sound coming from the back of the Dawn Treader. I threw on my foul weather gear, a fancy rain jacket and overalls, and ran outside to investigate. There, hanging by a rope tied to the cleat on the stern of the boat, was a completely submerged crystal kayak. Barely floating beside it was the dinghy, full to the top with water, with the gas tank floating freely on the surface. The only reason it hadn't also sunk is that it was still attached to the davits, which were begrudgingly holding it just above the water level. I knew I was in big trouble with no one nearby to help. My first thought was to call Lauren and ask her to take one of the cabin's kayaks and come over to help me try to lift the crystal kayak out of the water. But I quickly dismissed that idea, as it would not only get Lauren soaked to the bone, but would leave our kids alone in a strange house with no power in a massive storm. But what else could I do? Before this, I had never even been able to lift the dry crystal kayak by myself, despite having tried to do so on many occasions. Whenever I used the kayak before this, I would ask Lauren or the two girls or anyone in earshot to help me. Now here it was, completely underwater except for a tiny tip peeking out. I would need superhuman strength to lift it by myself. It's amazing what superpowers you find inside yourself when you are left with no other choice. The wind and the waves and the rain were all working against me, and I knew if I didn't act right then that the tiny little rope holding her to the Dawn Treader would surely snap and I might lose her forever. If she didn't wash out to sea, she would surely end up shattered on the rocks on shore. I just had to lift her out of the water right then, all by myself. To my utter amazement, I did it. I reached down and pulled on the bow of the kayak while standing on the bottom step. I did my best to squat down and use the power in my quads to take the brunt of the weight as I slowly inched it higher and higher out of the water. All the while, the Dawn Treader was swinging in wide half circles through strong currents, making the job even harder. But inch by inch, I did it. As I slowly pulled that kayak out of the water, I heard the voice of my daughter, Ahava, from 10 years earlier, when I was trying to push a 100-pound jogging stroller with two toddlers up a very steep hill. "You can do it, Mommy, little by little and bit by bit." Back then, her adorable, squeaky voice gave me the extra push I needed, and the memory of it did that for me again. I seriously can't remember a time in my life that I ever felt so strong and powerful as I did the moment I walked up the steps carrying that crystal kayak to the forward deck all by myself. Moments like these are really all that matters to me about the boat and our liveaboard life. Come to think of it, that is true of stories like these throughout my life. I am talking about the moments, however they come, when you find yourself unexpectedly doing something or learning something or pushing through something that formerly seemed impossible and resided completely outside your comfort zone. The moments that test you in ways you didn't expect. And if you are lucky enough to experience that growth and learning beside the most beloved members of your personal tribe, then you are blessed beyond measure. We did that on Hakuna Matata and the Dawn Treader, and I am forever grateful. That said, I will admit that that night, alone on that boat, I wasn't feeling all that grateful or blessed. Again, I may have let a few expletives slip as I grabbed one of the kids' pool noodle squirt guns and used it to start slowly bailing out the dinghy. At least this time around, the kids were not close enough to hear me. And that is chapter 9, Crystal Kayaks, Losing Sight of the Shore, How to Live on a Boat Without Killing Your Family. I apologize for the internet mess. Hopefully that was enough to continue and record. Hopefully it recorded. And if you are interested, I should be back live next Tuesday in a more stable environment to read the next chapter of Losing Sight of the Shore, How to Live on a Boat Without Killing Your Family. Thanks for watching. I really appreciate you. Bye.